Where's Johnny? Is Johnny here? He's in the bar, probably. Johnny, you here? Yeah. Somebody else I'd like to bring up is somebody who isn't on the list of guests, but was actually very important to us in the latter years of Radio Caroline from the Mi Amigo. One of those unsung heroes. Nobody ever heard about them. Hopefully, nobody ever saw them. One of the guys who used to operate a tender for us. Where's Rusty? Rusty's coming up. Coming up, Rusty. This guy who's coming up now used to operate a tender. And just to reiterate, it was highly dangerous to operate a tender because if he got caught, I mean, if we got caught, we got caught. But if he got caught, his livelihood went because he was a fisherman. He would have lost everything. And this bloke, who's coming up to the stage now, I clearly recall, and it was the only tender skipper who ever got it. The others did it for money, and there's nothing wrong in that. They were paid a fee, and they transported people and goods to the radio ship. This guy was paid a fee, but he got it. He understood what Caroline was all about, and I can't remember your Oppo, but I remember on one trip, he turned to his Oppo, his lad who helped him on the boat, on the fishing boat. He didn't think I could hear him. And he just said very quietly to his pal on the fishing boat, he said, "Can you feel the atmosphere? Can you feel the aura?" And this guy was a big, burly Kent fisherman. Now these guys you didn't mess with, but it touched him in the way that it touched us. And I'm guessing in the way that it touched you as well. So let me introduce the new panel. Nick Richards, Jeremy Chartham, Cliff Osbourne,
whatever,
Stephen Bishop, and Rusty. So just like in the last panel, we're the guys who kind of were there 78 until the end. Obviously Chicago was still around in 78, as were some of the other guys, but we split it up into these sections. So any questions specifically to do with the time frame that we're talking about, 77 to 80, but as I say, more specifically, 79 to 80. Fire away. Somebody waving their hand? I'll accept 20, 25. Oh, no. Robbie Owen.
Hi. My impression was that towards the end of the 70s, you were really struggling, and it was almost inevitable that something serious was going to go wrong. Several things had already happened to the boat, but there seemed to be a faith that, the Mi Amigo will come through. So to see that photograph of the ship underwater was a real shock. You know, the luck had run out. What was it like in that final year? Were things running out of luck?
I'll get the rest of the guys first. Secondly, I think my take on it is it wasn't so much the last year. It was the last 3 months.
From Christmas, wasn't it, really?
Just started to fall apart, and I mean literally fall apart. And you know, I'm sure Johnny will explain more about keeping the thing together. But she was knackered. The Mi Amigo was tired, and I was talking to somebody in the bar earlier. We
were both talking about this earlier on, yeah.
And it's very easy for you to listen to what I'm about to say and think I'm being daft, and I understand that. But for most of us who spent any time at all on the Mi Amigo, she was far more than a ship. She was a thing, a living entity. And I honestly believe that at the end, she was knackered. She was absolutely exhausted. She protected so many people. And I would just say this. You think about all the horror stories that you've heard about the Mi Amigo. There was a DVD playing earlier, which is available for sale, which had close-ups right at the very end, and you can see the layers of rust and how bent and buckled she was. But she protected us all, and she always, always protected everyone who was on her. And it's my opinion that at the end, she just got tired, and she fell apart gracefully, if you like. She slowly started letting it be known that she'd had enough. And right at the very end, she could have easily... I mean, you talk to the experts,
She could have just turned turtle, couldn't
Absolutely.
she?
The
So
marine
easily.
experts would tell you she was going to snap, she was going to break her anchor, she was going to turn, she was going to do all sorts. She didn't. She found a sandbank and she gently said to us, come on, guys, off you go. I need to go now. And she went very peacefully. And I get very emotional even as I speak now. But that's honestly how I feel. But yeah, I mean, Robbie, I'm sorry, I'm strayed a bit from your question. Towards the end of I suppose towards the very back end of 78 and the start of 79, it was pretty obvious that something drastic was going to happen.
I remember at the beginning of 79, there was a problem and everybody had to leave the ship. And I was taking out, I think it was Johnny and a few others out on the Sunday. And Peter went out on a fishing boat the night before. And we got out to the ship the next morning. And she was just leaning over like this. There was not a bit of power on it. And the stories I'd had about the way Peter had leapt from this other fishing boat and stayed on the night before. And it was like, I remember coming back that night, it was just like a miracle. The thing was still there. And within 3 months, she was back on the air. But she was tired.
Well, Cliff and I were on the boat with Peter when Peter... I mean, I don't know, and I'm looking at Peter now as I say this. He was either incredibly brave or he was stupid. And the honest truth is, we went out to look, and there was never any mention of anyone going on board. And as Rusty says, as we got close by, it was pitch black, but you could see she was in a sorry state. She was listing. She was really low in the water. And, Peter once again saved the day and leapt across. And I have to say, publicly, Peter, it was a bloody stupid thing you did. Because apart from anything else, we turned round and went back to harbour thinking he's going to kill himself. And we're going to have to face his family and say, well, we did try to stop. But no, I mean, thankfully he did. But
it gave it another lease of life, doesn't it? Because after that, came back on the air in Easter.
Peter, that day we went out, I didn't expect to see the ship there, let alone you on it. It was absolutely incredible. I mean, speaking as somebody who's spent a few years out there, that was courage. To stay on board a ship that was completely and absolutely derelict, that was half full of water and leaning over with no power, nothing, on your own all night. Wow. And the fishermen that took you out there, they were very impressed. They said to me afterwards, they could not believe the way you just leapt on board. I think it was on the stern you leapt on, and that was it, go away.
The short time that I spent on board, I can't say I ever felt anything other than safe, but you could see the years of hard work that she'd put in, and she was in a sorry state in parts that you could see. But she always felt safe to me, and I was never actually there for any dramas. But I think you could tell that she was getting to the end of her life, and it was sad when she did eventually go. As Bob's explained, I think we all feel like that.
I think if any of you have got tapes of the programmes from like late 79 into 80, if you listen very carefully, sometimes during the winter, you can actually hear water rushing while we've got the microphone on. It was like that, wasn't it? We actually had water in the studio rushing where she was. I mean, a couple of times with the Albert and Georgina thing, remember that? We sprung a Christmas, New Year, 79, we sprung a hell of a big leak. Nobody would have known. We had a couple of guests on board. And I think I was on the air, wasn't I? I came upstairs and said to Busby, "Here, lad, quick, come down here, have a look at this."
He used to do this quite a lot. Come down here and have a look at this.
Come and have a look at this. And we had an inspection hole at the bottom of the stairway going down to the cabins in the studio. Well, there's water coming in everywhere, wasn't there? We just continued. We didn't want the people, most of the people on board to know what was going on, did we? And we just started the pumps, found where the leak was, which is in the engine room again. And this was almost a daily occurrence, and I think Peter will tell you this is almost a daily occurrence towards the end, wasn't it? Sort of fixing leaks and holes.
We were saying earlier in the bar that I don't want to hog this, so I'll say this and then shut up. But we were saying in the bar that if you look at the history of offshore radio, in the 1960s, Caroline came on, and then, if you remember, Caroline was going to be blown away by this thing called Radio London, because Radio London had money behind it, and they had apparently far better disc jockeys, and they invested in programmes. And Radio London, so I'm told, was fantastic. And then it closed down. And Caroline continued, okay, and then it closed down. But if you look at the 70s, and again, Peter will know better than most, Mebo came on with all the money. fantastic ship, huge mast,
Aerials everywhere.
so many transmitters. And it was fantastic. What a great station. And then it closed down. Veronica, as you guys know better than me, it was doing the business, as we would say. It was cleaning up. But then it closed down. And Caroline continued. And then in the 80s, Laser came on. And Laser was going to wipe the floor. Do you remember? And then it closed down. And Caroline continued. And Caroline still continues to this day. And if you look at it, defies any logic. I mean, I'm sure even Chicago would say, you know, how the hell did nobody die on that ship?
Yeah.
Can anybody answer that?
No. Or get seriously injured. That's another thing. Nobody
Absolutely.
got seriously injured, did they?
Absolutely.
Somebody said in an email to the studio a couple of months ago now, actually, said there are now 3 certainties in life: taxes, death, and Radio Caroline.
Any other questions? Robbie Owen.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hog this, but it's a very interesting period, and I follow the station closely. How as presenters, you must have felt very threatened because commercial radio was growing across the UK.
Never bothered
the
us.
atmosphere was changing. How close to your audience did you feel?
Completely close. And I, speaking personally, and again, I'm going to shut up, it never bothered us because we knew from the sack loads of mail that we got, we knew that our audience were listening to us because nobody else was doing what we did. There was no other way they could listen to what we were doing.
And Melody Maker, wasn't it? There was a poll in Melody Maker where I think Caroline was 4th most popular station. And it was doing something different as well. It was playing the album tracks. Yeah, all right, it was maybe some of it was a bit poppy and that, and I was probably one of the guilty ones for that. But it had the audience. It was different, wasn't it?
If you
could hear.
top 40, there was loads of stations that you could hear that on. You couldn't hear the album format anywhere than Caroline.
That's it. I mean, we'd pick on stuff like, we would play the Bee Gees, but we wouldn't play Night Fever. We'd play Spirits Having Flown. Next thing, you'd hear Radio 1 playing it. Judy Zook, classics, Stay With Me Till Dawn. They were playing the A side. We played the B side, which was Stay With Me Till Dawn. They suddenly flipped it over and started playing Stay With Me Till Dawn. Classic. They were
Barclay
listening.
James Harvest.
Exactly. Yeah. So we knew they were listening. I mean, the classic one was Steve Wright on Luxembourg, wasn't it? Closing down, saying hello to the guys on the Mi Amigo. I know you're listening. You know, stuff like that.
When it sank, you must have thought that was it, surely.
I don't know, really, did we?
In all honesty, when it sank, I was just heartbroken and just
You weren't the only one.
just didn't know what the hell to think. And it was just raw emotion, I think, rather than thought.
I think the person who should talk about that is, I don't know if many people know this as well, and I was saying to, I can't remember who it was in the bar, Nigel and I go back even before Caroline, don't we, Nigel and I. Nigel was the very last person to turn the transmitters off on the Mi Amigo, weren't you? That's right. Nigel was down in the... We even, the ship even allowed Nigel to turn the transmitters off. You know, that's what it was like. I mean, maybe you'd like to say more, Nigel. Or Nick.
I think most people know the history of what happened on that night, more or less. Just to cut to the part of it where I think Stevie and Tom, they'd done a close-down announcement. A little bit before that, I'd been priming a pump. There was a diesel pump, which we kept in the forepeak, never really used it. But we got to a point where in the engine room, it was just coming in far too quick. There was an electric pump, which you might remember, Johnny. It was a hugely powerful electric pump.
This pump was, it used to throw so much water over the side.
That wasn't coping, so I went to the forepeak, dragged this diesel pump down. Took a while to prime and get going, but then there was the 2 pumps pumping all this stuff out, and it just wasn't quick enough. And I went looking for Stevie and for Tom, and I went into the main section, and all I heard was Caroline by the Fortunes. And maybe 10, 15 minutes before that, when I was looking for the pump, I'd seen Tom, and we kind of exchanged a look without actually saying anything.
You knew, didn't you?
We kind of thought, shit, we've done everything we can do. And I think that the two of them had said, look, maybe it's a point, we'll call it a day. The lifeboat had been there since early afternoon, just sat there. So I think at the time the plan was, let's go off the air, let's go on the lifeboat, we'll just sit it out. If the weather calms down a bit, we'll hop back on. So I heard Caroline by the Fortunes just fade away. I think I heard Stevie say, someone better turn the transmitter off. So I walked through the mess room, through the Dutch studio, down the transmitter hold. and reached out just to turn the transmitter off. And something at the time I thought, well, maybe just leave it on for a second or two longer. And if you've heard that recording of it, that's me just pausing, just thinking for give it some distinction. It's not we're just turning it off. So I left it for a few seconds, and then you hear the tone go and the carrier's gone, and
that was it.
That was kind of it. But then, just cut to the chase of the lifeboat. We all got safely onto the lifeboat, and when all four of us were there, including the canary, Wilson the canary. The hatch in the lifeboat, we were in a sealed little kind of bubble. You couldn't see anything out, but one of the crew opened the hatch and called down and said, all the lights have gone out on your ship. Do you want to hang around? And I thought we looked at each other and said, well,
no point.
What's the point? And we didn't think they weren't lying to us. There was no reason for them to lie. I mean, the lights had gone out. It meant the water had got to the point where the Henschel generator, which we were running on, it obviously covered that. All the power was gone, so it was going fairly fast at that point. So we headed in and were greeted by endless police cars with flashing lights and Sheerness. So that was kind of what happened on that night. But just what you were saying, Busby, about the tender trips and feeling safe on the ship. The one time I felt sometimes, no disrespect, Rusty, but I found sometimes the tender journey, you felt that was the one point you might get nabbed, either leaving the UK or leaving Spain or Holland or Belgium, wherever, France, or coming back in. But when you got onto the Mi Amigo, it was like, you
were safe.
You landed on land.
It was like one of the reasons I think most of us, like Mike, Peter and myself, spent so long on the boat was we didn't want to go ashore, so we didn't want to be nabbed.
There you go.
You thought, I'll leave it for another tender. That was the one thing that used to worry. And that's why people like Rusty here, you got to hand it to them. They went through that literally sometimes 2-3 times a week. They'd be backwards and forwards to the ship.
In the summer of '79, when there wasn't much money around and there wasn't much fuel, we were taking out a couple of tons at a time from some little creek just down below Ramsgate, playing games with the police boat. And there wasn't much money around, and I used to have to go around to road shows and collect the money in 50p coins, which took a long time. But that last tender, that was like a portent for what was happening, because I think, Nick, we were at a tender the day before.
That's right.
Yeah. There was a Jonah on board the Mi Amigo, and because that last tender to take the person out took about 2 weeks, if I remember. Was it, Stuart? We had all sorts of problems. We once got off of Margate to go out, because I'd been busted with Peter Chicago the Christmas before, and I couldn't use my own boat, so we had to use somebody else's boat. And we broke down off of Margate, had 3 flares on the boat, sent 2 off. The final one attracted the attention of a container ship, and all the food, all the records and everything else had to go over the side. And they didn't sink. And I remember we were picked up by this 30,000-ton container ship. Said, "Oh, do you want to tow to Sheerness?" And there was all this food going around. But did we have that the Dutch guy on there then, Tom? No, we took him out afterwards, and it took about 2 weeks to get out to you then. And that last tender, the coming back, the day before it sank. We were just hitting the beginning of the storm, and the boat nearly broke on the way back. And Nigel went. Yeah, he went over the side.
He actually Nigel went over the side.
Yeah, he was having a leak because we were fixing some problem with the engine, and we were coming back because the weather was getting bad, and we made 2 Dutchmen that we were taking off. I don't know if you're here this afternoon. Sorry, but we made you sit on the stern. Didn't matter if you went, you were expendable. It was to keep the prop biting. And the boat started to break up, unfortunately. We lost the gantry, we lost everything else. And it took about 17 hours, I think, to get back then. And Nigel was standing there having a pee near the Tongue Lightship. And all of a sudden, somebody said, "Nigel's gone!" It was just a handover, and we got him by the hair, and in he came. So that was a portent, but there was a Jonah.
It's short now.
The hair was longer then.
One of the things that I think we're all guilty of, all of us who are interested in offshore radio, is that we look back now and we have images of radio ships on nice sunny days and it's flat calm, and you think, those guys were playing the records with the hatch open and swimming, and it was fantastic. And I don't think, and here's an idea for somebody, the other side of offshore radio is it was dangerous. And I see stuff on the internet nowadays. Even now, people are going on about starting offshore stations. Well, good luck to you. but it's dangerous. I mean, I can't tell you how lucky we were that nobody died.
No.
You know, I'm not very technical, but there's a big machine, 50,000 watts, this thing. 50,000 watts. And to power that, you need big generators. And you're sitting, as we were, and if any station wants to start now, 20 odd miles from the nearest land. That's a long way. 20 miles on land, you think, oh, that's from here to Auntie Bessie's house.
15 minutes. Yeah.
20 miles is a long way.
And the Knock Deep was a pretty remote old place. Nobody went to Knock Deep. It was quiet.
And that's the other side. And we wouldn't talk about the dangerous side on the air. But there were instances, I don't know if, is Ad Roberts in the room? No, he's not. There was one occasion, one winter, when the Dutch couldn't get guys out to the ship. And the word leak keeps coming up, but I went for a leak over the side. I went to have a wee, and I saw these fireworks going up in the sky. And then, of course, within seconds, you realise they're not fireworks, they're flares, they're distress flares. So we called for a lifeboat because we'd seen these distress flares. It was a bunch of disc jockeys who'd got in a rubber boat to head out
From Ramsgate. Yeah.
to the radio ship. I mean, I'm sorry to keep using this phrase, they could have died. You know, and we glibly look at the sea and, you know, here's somebody who spent a huge chunk of your life at sea. You know, here's the cliche, she's a dangerous mistress and she will kill you. And I'm not saying all offshore radio disc jockeys are fantastic, but what I am saying is sometimes you need to think about that aspect. And we've highlighted, you know, Chicago's antics. We've talked about when Nick Richards nearly died because the ship nearly sank. But there's loads of stuff in between. I mean, Cliff mentioned that he always felt safe. You didn't. There was one afternoon, God, this is going to sound dreadful, but one afternoon we were both in bed. He was in the bottom bunk, I was in the top bunk, or vice versa. And it wasn't particularly rough, but she rolled over. And she did this quite a lot, and then she'd roll back, and then she'd roll back. And she rolled over.
And stayed there for a long time.
And she just stayed there. And I'd been on the ship before him, so I was trying to be all butch and macho, and hey, everything's fine. And I thought, oh my God, she's not going to come back. Now again, you know, you can accuse me of dramatising this, but the simple fact is, when you're at that angle, you can either go one way or the other. And it just depends what the sea's doing.
Especially when you've got a tower that's not meant to be on a radio ship or on a ship, you know, because those towers, I don't know, Peter, what was the weight of the one on the Ross? It was quite a few tons, wasn't it?
35.
Yeah, 35 tons, yeah. I mean, you know, not most ships don't have 35 tons of metal above them at, 275 foot.
Well, she stayed there like that for what seemed like an age.
It was, yeah. We got a question from a man with a microphone.
Oh.
You were telling us that you all were free to choose the music you're going to play, yeah? But even then, music radio was there to sell the music. So we all bought Rick Wakeman or other records. But what I always miss here is the other end of the business. Was there any response in these times from the musicians and from the bands themselves to you guys?
Oh, loads, wasn't it? Loads, absolutely loads. Yeah, and it would come from sometimes really unexpected people, wasn't it? Like you get it from the rock, you know, Rick Wakeman, stuff like that, but you'd also get it from the sort of pops, you know, from the actual top 40 stuff as well. I mean, we never had any problems. I mean, we had offices in London, didn't we? I mean, we say that now, but the record companies knew where our offices were. They weren't supposed to supply us with records, but they were more willing to supply us with records than they were the likes of certainly the IBA. I mean, it was like Radio 1, Radio 2, Caroline, then IBA stations. That was how they used to supply, because it was like a record on Caroline was worth more than on any ILR station, as it were. So, yeah, we got a lot of recognition from the music industry. I think you'd agree with that. Yeah.
Fish listens to Caroline today. I don't know who might have been listening then. I haven't heard any particular stories. But no, Johnny is right. We did get an awful lot of product. sent by the record companies, because I guess they knew that Caroline would be the only station that would play not just the single, but would play other tracks off the album and try and bring
this was not
the
only
wider thing to people's attention.
This was not only in the Mi Amigo days, but also the Ross days as well, Ross Revenge. So,
Does that answer your question?
is that all right?
Did any of the musicians get in touch and say thank you? Is that?
Oh yeah,
the
yeah.
gist
We
of
used
what
to
you're
have them,
saying?
but they wouldn't come out to the ship for obvious reasons. Yeah. So.
I think. Well, I mean, I'm sure it's Rob Eden was looking after things at.
Well, the classic one was Mike. What was it? Mike Oldfield and Richard Branson, wasn't it? Really, Virgin, and the Floyd for Dark Side. They were still going on, weren't they? Back in when we were out there.
Rob Eden was running things in London, and you probably know Rob's background, apart from radio, was the music industry, and Rob was the guy who dealt with all the record companies, and yeah, there was always feedback coming back, which was nice. It was gratifying, if that's the word. Yes, question.
Yes.
Terry can tell you about the Ross Revenge here.
Well, no, I mean, that was coincidence. I saw the Ross Revenge on another trip in '79, when she'd just been laid up. But somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember I introduced Rob Eden to a guy in Ramsgate who was a shipbroker, and they were looking at a weather ship. I forget the name of the weather ship now, but there was these big plans. Do you remember this, Peter? A huge, great weather ship. That's it, the Weather Surveyor.
Yeah.
So there were plans. Well, talks, but I don't know what happened after that.
One of the things that I thought you might be interested in is when Caroline came back in April '79. She'd been off the air for, was it 6 months, Johnny?
6 months, yeah.
6 months or so, and I mean, that 6 month period you could write a book about. That was an amazing time, full of amazing incidents.
I think we spent most of it on there, didn't we?
We did,
Chicago,
yeah. But then all of a sudden, in April '79, she took everybody. I mean, took me by surprise. I had no idea, and there she was back. And one of the guys who was around at that time, Jeremy, you came on just after, didn't you? Just after.
Yes, it was one of the trips I did. In fact, the last trip where I stayed on board for some time, it had already come back on air. I think it came back on at Easter, didn't it? I probably went out a month later.
And what state was it in? Because it's been well documented.
What, you mean the state of the ship or
Yeah.
the state of the service?
The ship, because I mean, we've had 6 months of we had 6 months of, quite frankly, very little food, no fuel at one point. I remember, and these guys will back me up, Peter will back me up, at one point we didn't even have a light on the ship during this 6 months, and the only lighting that we had, remember this was a vessel 20 miles from land, the only lighting we had was a Coke can with a J-cloth in it, with a tiny bit of diesel in the bottom of the J-cloth, and we had to use that sparingly. And
Any time a ship came near.
we all had to go, as soon as it became dark, we all had to go to the bridge with pots and pans from the kitchen. We had to leave the door of the bridge open so that we could hear any engines of passing ships, and if we heard anything, we'd go out and bang the pots and pans as loudly as we could. So we'd gone through all that, and then Caroline had come back in Easter. So
Yeah, I think it had been off the air for some time, and I spent a period out there as one of the caretaker crew as well when it was off the air with Peter and Tony Allen and Tom Anderson. There was just the four of us on there for about 6 weeks. But there was a feeling, I think Peter had been changing one of the 10 kilowatt transmitters to 558 around that time. There were some tests to try and see if there was a clearer channel further up and the signal could get out better on 558. But there did seem to be a definite feeling that they weren't going to rush into getting back on the air, that everything was going to be just right and hunky-dory. And I think the period that it was off the air until it came on, which was about 6 months or so, something like that, there was this definite attitude that it was going to be topped up with fuel, there was going to be enough water and food and everything, so that when it did come back on, I think Tom Hardy was that it was going to stay on the air at least for a significant amount of time before it needed another tender. So there wasn't a sort of a rush period of, let's just get back on the air as soon as possible. The time was taken to make sure that everything was just right. But as you say, the state of the ship was just getting worse, and we were constantly making these little concrete boxes with bits of wood poked into holes in the hull every time a leak sprung. There must have been several dozen of them, I should think, by the time the thing finally sank.
There is a little story about the way you eventually got all the stuff that went out there. I think it was during the winter of 78 or early 79. There was a barge washed up on the beach at Margate. And there was a fellow nicknamed Earthquake Peter, and I think the condition was he helped out providing you played his earthquake theory over the air. He and his friend, now Earthquake Peter had a nuclear bunker dug at his garage in Broadstairs. You go down 20 or 30 feet and welcome to my nuclear bunker. He and his friend dug this barge out. They bought the rights, salvage rights to the barge. They dug this barge out. They filled it with however much fuel they could get on, with water and everything else. And I remember he came to me and he said, how do I get to the ship? So I drew a picture in the sand. I said, look, we're here. You go not quite, it's sort of north-northeast here, and you just keep going. And if you stop, you've hit the sandbank, just go back and come. And if you see a big beacon there, you've gone too far. Oh, okay. And he did it. I mean, I used to go out with him much electronics as you could get on the thing there then. But he just went in the distance. And I think that was it, wasn't it, the barge?
They got lost for it.
They got lost for days.
The history of Caroline is littered with basket cases.
And how this man just went out and he said, we asked the Harwich train ferry which way to go.
Listen, guys, we're running out of time here. So, question yet?
Small one. Just wondering, listening to the stories about the danger, somebody mentioned a while ago us being a bit mad about radio. Isn't it the other way around? Because you're sitting on a ship in the dark with pots and pans.
We're the mad ones.
We're completely balmy, you're right.
Yeah, but you wouldn't do it. You wouldn't do it if you didn't, you believed in it and you believed in entertainment.
Caroline.
Yeah, Caroline. And each other. Yeah, and each other. That was the other thing, because you always look for each other. I mean, classic story was Busby and myself, wasn't it? Peter gave us, I'll tell you what, Peter, he gave us grey hair one day. It was a really bad storm, and we looked everywhere for Peter, and we thought he'd gone over the side. We searched the bloody place high and low. I think you were up in the galley making a cup of tea, Peter. It's the only place we didn't look. That was on the Mi Amigo, but you did. You were always aware of who was around you. You had to be. I mean, as Busby was saying, the sad thing about radio now is you go in, go out, go in, go out. It was never like that with Caroline. It was you were a team, weren't you, basically? And if you weren't a team, the thing would have sunk.
Nobody, in my 2 years, nobody on Radio Caroline went there for any other reason than they were a listener to Caroline and wanted to work on Radio Caroline.
Yep.
I can't speak for any other era, but that was the way it was. And you were there for one reason, which was Caroline.
Yep.
Anybody with any kind of ego problem didn't last.
And there was never any of that on the Mi Amigo. I mean, the Ross Revenge, that's another story. But the Mi Amigo, you were there because you wanted to be there, and it was the station you wanted to be on. You wanted to do your best, give entertainment, but you were there as a team, and that's the most important thing. You're there as a team, and that's what kept the thing afloat, until it sank. But that's another story.